We're doing for this season called Artists on Art. And the idea of this program is to use the talent and expertise that's right here in Cleveland to learn more about the exhibitions and the artworks that moCa has on view. So each month, about the third Saturday of each month, an artist who lives here in Cleveland and works in Cleveland will be talking about one or more of the works on view in A Poethical Wager or downstairs for Phil Collins' exhibition. Our first inaugural artist, I am pleased to introduce, is Sara Cabot. Sara and I have known each other for 11 years. We actually worked together on Sara's solo exhibition at moCa Cleveland back in our old space. That was in 2006. Since that time, Sara has gone on to have an illustrious career here in the region, but also beyond. She is currently Associate Professor and Chair of Drawing at the Cleveland Institute of Art. She won the 2017 Cleveland Arts Prize for Mid-Career Artist this year, and has had exhibitions at most of the museums in the region and then in many venues outside of the region. She's going to be talking primarily about this body of work by Doug Ashford, and without further ado, I will turn it to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Megan. Thank you guys all for coming. Thank you to moCa for inviting me to talk about this work and kind of the larger cultural context around this work, and in some ways how my work actually fits into that as well. And so when I first walked through this exhibition, I was already quite drawn to the Doug Ashfords. I had seen several of his paintings this last summer at Mass moCa, and was very engaged with them, not only because of the subject matter, the idea of abstraction and representation married together in a single image, but also the ways in which he's really dealing with a particular kind of politic. The work that he chooses to appropriate, or the images that he chooses to appropriate, are often very politically charged moments that are recorded in newspapers and major newspapers of record, specifically the New York Times. Here in this series of work, we can actually see the newspapers from September 12th, 2001, right? Yeah, so the day after 9/11. And so even just in this kind of selection, he's really choosing a very charged political moment and kind of documenting that moment in full, or presenting what would appear to be a documentation of that thing in full. So this is the entire first section of the paper, and we actually see every single page, from the front page to the last page of that paper. Doug Ashford has long engaged in political work with his group, with a collective group material in the 1980s and 90s. He actually engaged in a lot of curatorial practices that actually presented political moments through a variety of different kind of aesthetic viewpoints. And so here in his individual work, he's actually really, again, doing that, engaging with a kind of political moment in sort of dealing with it from several different viewpoints. In those larger works, or in the kind of collective work of the group material, they were very often sort of dealing with abstraction and information as a way of kind of navigating the various avenues and points of view on a given political moment, let's say the AIDS crisis of the 80s. And now in this work, he's again sort of looking at the moment after September 11th and this kind of documentation of power through media. And also sort of the documentation of power through all of these other avenues that we're starting to see that get documented in the newspaper itself. What was the individual social reaction to the day of 9/11? What was the kind of cultural reaction to the day of 9/11? What begins to be the sort of governmental reaction to the day of 9/11? And given that this is, the place where Doug Ashford lives in New York, it's not only something that he's documenting kind of from a distance, but also something that he's kind of very wed to, that this is an attack on his hometown. Simultaneously, Doug is really dealing with an idea of abstraction. And like many of the artists in this exhibition, it kind of refers to a 1960s idea of abstraction, or it has those kinds of references, I believe, in it, in these kind of colorful interventions into the work. So, in an image like this, we actually see all of these layers of abstraction kind of overlaying the newspaper. Or, here it's something where the abstraction is actually cutting out or omitting individual sequences. And in something like this, the abstraction is actually highlighting components of the referent image. One of the things that I think is most powerful about that kind of idea of these multiple different versions of what an abstraction looks like is the notion, it's sort of a repetition of the notion that that this moment, this kind of historical moment, over time is getting viewed through all of these different lenses. So who is to say what does this abstraction mean? I don't know. So Deb, what do you think like this? What does this kind of abstraction remind you of?
It reminds me of sort of this, I love the layering effect, so it wants you to either really look into what's behind it, try and figure it out, and then why is it where it's at, and what's behind it, and what does he want you to focus on?
Right, so what is that, what does that picture mean? What about you, Tony?
Can I talk
You
about
can
one
pick
to the
this
writer?
one, yeah.
I keep thinking about Joseph Alber's color studies in a lot of these images, which is interesting in terms of like a focus and layering information that we take for granted every day.
And you mean the information that we take for granted as the newspaper information, but or also the kind of color information?
Right, like that's what Albers was trying to explore in that kind of juxtaposition of all these things in set with one another. So, it makes me think about ordering that information from the newspaper in a similar way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly sort of thinking about all of those things too, and especially the idea that there's a kind of hierarchy created in any given image, but then when we actually look to the next image in the series, like that hierarchy actually might be undermined, or that what is actually getting highlighted is an entirely different set of information. So here, we have an idea of the kind of hierarchy of information, really involving these headers. But here, the hierarchy of information seems to say that there's, something kind of happening outside of what we imagine to be the center of the subject of information. In relationship to my work, I'm certainly often thinking about that there is a kind of power dynamic between, what information is recorded publicly, so in a newspaper, and then how we receive that information, how that's actually ordered for us, what actually gets to be the first image, what supposedly is the most potent image in a newspaper, and then what is, sort of further inside the fold. Are those less significant images? There's still things that happen to real people, and that when I'm thinking about the politics of the politics of power as distributed through media, I'm certainly also imagining or thinking about how over time those images become themselves abstracted, right? So if we think back to the images of 9/11, we certainly we imagine the falling man, right? And that is kind of the most potent image. But then here within even just this kind of most important newspaper of record for New Yorkers, we actually see, dozens of images that actually record everything around this particular moment. But these have very often kind of fallen off of our mental radar, whereas this one sort of stands as the symbol of that moment. And in that way, I think they all kind of become abstracted or sort of occluded over time. There's a little booklet of my work kind of making its way around. And again, that's something that I really think about as well, that, we collect, or that there's this kind of instrument of power, this newspaper of record, that all of these events are happening in the world, that they are supposedly kind of primary or of really high significance, but given time and distance from that particular event, the power of that event to actually impact empathy or sympathy on the part of the viewer is actually really dissolved. The images themselves become icons, or they even become less than that. They just, kind of turn into the detritus of like visual culture. And so in a lot of my work, I'm also trying to resuscitate what that image might have meant in the moment that it actually was published, but also conflate it with this idea that everything is kind of being disrupted or dissolved over time. Certainly that's something that Doug Ashford is also doing, these, bless you, that these images, again, had a kind of particular political import, and that they are being kind of disrupted by the abstraction. In terms of the abstraction itself, one of the things that I think is really interesting about what Doug Ashford has pointed out is that this kind of formalistic abstraction is in itself a kind of diagram, It's a diagram for how to look at things. It's a diagram for what to highlight. It is a diagram of a particular kind of thinking that is not necessarily like directly political, right? It is, this kind of abstract diagram is a referent to a kind of abstract thinking that may not in itself be kind of co-opted by power, or directly co-opted by those in power, but it in itself is a way of sort of thinking about not only the information that is behind those images, but it is a way of like thinking in and of itself. This abstraction is a method of imagining all sorts of different possibilities, and sort of using those different possibilities to kind of reflect on what is back there in the images. I think one of the interesting things that I was also considering in relationship to this work is that, these are really, that abstraction that is happening on the top here is really beautiful, right? It's using like very seductive colors. It is a kind of abstraction that refers to painting that is very rich. What that kind of beauty in kind of collapsing in relationship to the newspapers behind it is in itself a kind of, it's potentially fraught, right? That it's kind of, I think it has the potential to kind of be viewed as like glorifying or glamorizing this kind of tragic event that happened, or aestheticizing it in some way. I don't come down on one side or another of that kind of point, but I think it's a relevant point to kind of bring up in relationship to the work, that formal beauty kind of makes me a little bit more uncomfortable about, engaging in the work. And I think that discomfort is actually a really fascinating mirror with which to view my own assumptions about how I'm supposed to feel when I look at these images. So, the assumption is that I should feel pity or empathy or, strength about how our country has bounced back, or even just remembering that particular day and imagining my friends who were there in traveling through New York on that day, that it kind of refers back to their personal experience. And the idea, I think, for them of that day of anything that would sort of glamorize it, I think would be, to some extent distasteful. So I think that there is something, again, sort of a little bit uncomfortable that's being presented in this formal, like beautiful, formal, seductive overlay of abstract imagery over these kind of tragic events. But again, that to me really sort of points out that there's more than one way for us to actually engage in this historical moment, or more than one way for us to kind of view that historical moment, the kind of codified ways that we are taught by our culture to view, these kinds of tragedies, stepping through the stages of grief and then kind of being done with it, maybe those are problems in and of themselves as well. And sort of looking at this work and kind of going through each individual image, another thing that I really think about is size and scale. So Doug Ashford's work is very often to scale with the reference, or even smaller. So he's really thinking about not just what this picture is, the picture of the newspaper, but literally how we engage with it. We engage with it sort of moment by moment as we kind of scan across it, rather than as a kind of, he's not making this into a large monumental work. He's sort of dealing with it in the scale that it was. And a lot of his work actually engages with this idea of, keeping this small scale as making the viewer actually navigate back and forth between this kind of small space and this kind of larger political and social point of view. And again, a lot of his work is also dealing with the notion of the archive. So certainly that we are looking at objects to scale in relationship to the archive is quite significant. That we must navigate them again, piece by piece. We must navigate it line by line, and we must attempt to decipher if we are at all to engage with the content of the work. So, those are some of the things that I'm thinking about in relationship to these. And I think that they're actually quite interesting I think that this installation is quite interesting in the gallery, given that, of course, now I have to do a little check here, that this work is actually directly facing the Abbas Akhavan work across. So something that is very kind of small and minute, but dealing with kind of larger political issues, is facing essentially a monumental work, a cutout of the wall, and that cutout actually was originally painted with the blue shield. The blue shield is a sign that cultural institutions around the world will paint on their roofs or ceilings, or it'll be a sign that lets others know that this is a significant place and should not be attacked. So he has gone and actually made this blue shield, cut it out of the wall here in moCa, and actually placed that cutout on the roof here. So whereas this is kind of a very small or minute, or kind of intense content at a very small scale, here we're dealing with that same kind of idea of war, protection, cultural intervention, but at a much larger scale. And also the idea here of negation, so that this work is actually taking the wall out of the gallery and replacing it in a place that we don't ordinarily think of it as going. And here again, we have negation, but it's a negation as opposed to by removal, it's by occluding. So here we have omission, and here we have a kind of veil between things. So that kind of relationship, I think, is quite powerful in thinking about the content of any of this work. I have some, I have some very strong feelings about the role of abstraction in any of this. I think, again, it's very easy to be told what to think in relationship to heavy or political and social issues, and that there are ways that are kind of acceptable culturally of dealing with those things, and that this abstraction really puts us as the viewer is a little bit potentially on edge. We actually have to engage with the work without necessarily like looking directly at the didactics and being told, oh, this is what this thing means and how it functions. We actually have to confront it. What does a hole mean? You know, what does a hole in this shape mean? You know, where is the thing that is actually missing? Or what does red mean here? We actually have to name it for ourselves. There's no kind of accepted symbolic language that we're dealing with. And in that, I think it really empowers the viewer to, you know, really potentially think very deeply about what is being presented in a much more, I don't know, in some ways in a much more kind of sincere way than if we're sort of given like, oh, this is political work, we understand, you know, that we're meant to march, or we're meant to feel sorry, or we're meant to hold hands. You know, here, this kind of tells us that, that there's not one way to kind of react to the difficulties that we experience in our larger political and social environment. So I wondered if you guys had questions about my work or this work. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, just noticing that in your talk, there was a strong tendency to talk about meaning and the intellect, and it seems to be ignoring an important aspect of art, which is how it functions with the emotional appeal it gives.
Well, I think, you know, that's a good point. I mean, to that point, what I am saying, especially with the caution about the seduction of it, is that that I do feel cautious, you know, about that emotional, about being sort of overtly emotional about the work, because I think that this work and this work actually does put caution in there. It doesn't, you know, the thing that is the most important thing here is missing. The symbol of a protected cultural site. You know, the thing that, you know, is supposedly telling us which emotion to feel is very often occluded here, you know? So that emotional content that is a big part of many, many kinds of art, I think is made confusing purposefully by these artists. And I attempt to do the same thing in much of my work. I attempt to not actually present something that tells you which emotion to feel in relationship to it, but that it's maybe the work itself is a meeting point where people who have different emotions about that day can meet and possibly discuss with one another what they thought about that referent. I mean, that's my point of view. Questions? Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about your project that involved the New York Times?
So in 2015, I collected every Sunday edition of the New York Times, particularly the front page. And in this small little brochure that's going around, there's a selection of the work that I've actually made from that. I would go through every week and cut out all of the figures from all of the background images, and then further cut those until they were like just the darkest parts of that. So they kind of have maybe like a squiggly line quality, and I'm cutting out the actual newspaper itself. So it's not laser cut or scanned and cut or anything like that. I'm actually cutting out the real thing. And so then once I have all of these cutouts, I then collapse them all into one another so that there's not a specific referent that's easily able to be kind of pulled out of that newspaper image. And I've done one of those for every week of 2015. So there are 52 plus for that. It's very important to me in those pieces that the work actually almost looks like a Rorschach blot, because I think our ability to identify what's happening in the image. I want to slow down our ability to identify what's happening in any one of those images. And paired with that, I have sort of saved some of the landscapes or backgrounds from where the people were removed. And so those I'm very interested in, the architecture of the space in which a moment of import has happened, but that the people have been removed from that. A lot of this has to do with my point of view that, you know, there are these significant moments happening all the time, that things that should be recorded by history, but they are instantly or almost instantly forgotten or almost instantly co-opted to you know, support a particular ideology that I may or may not agree with. So I want to sort of reflect that in the way that I'm engaging in that work. And then I've also collected all the I've collected all the New York Times and Plain Dealers from this year so far. So I expanded. I'm not precisely sure what I will do with those, but again, it's important to me to kind of collect those. I actually had a really wonderful conversation with a curatorial colleague, and she mentioned that after the most recent election, she felt the most important thing that she could do would be to subscribe to the newspaper, because that was supporting journalism. And I thought that, you know, of course, I was already subscribing to the Times, but I thought it important to kind of expand that to subscribing to the Plain Dealer as well, because I think we really, you know, it's really difficult to understand all of the complexity that's happening even on a local level, and anything that I can do as a consumer to support thoughtful journalism and recording of significant events that may not be if we don't have good journalism was important to me. Other questions? Barry?
You kind of touched on it with the Plain Dealer. I was wondering why the New York Times?
Mm-hmm.
Why not other large city or international, like the London Times?
Mm-hmm.
Or why not even smaller, sort of more rural or more
Yeah.
set-like
Newspapers, yeah. I think, so I started with the New York Times because I was already getting it, honestly. You know, so I was interested in that as a paper of record because I think it has extraordinarily high quality journalism. It engages in longer form journalism. It engages in journalism on a variety of different topics, you know, from like science, you know, to style or, you know, you know, so it engages in this really wide variety of topics, and it also has correspondence that it sends to other countries. So it's not just acquiring information from the AP, it is also engaging in its, you know, in original journalism. So that's part of why I started subscribing there. I think you're right to point out that, you know, every country or every city actually has its point of view on the news, and that is part of why I started to collect the Plain Dealer, because I think that it, again, is really important to think about what the local point of view is on the news and how that might be different than, you know, in a kind of external point of view. Or what counts as news or what counts as significant is different in this area. In terms of like a smaller rural paper, maybe that'll be like 2 years from now, I'm not really sure. But you know, I think that I do think about that issue, about what gets recorded, what is important to whom. I mean, my family lives in rural Michigan. Like, their local paper is, you know, 6 pages long. You know, it really is talking about special events that are there in their town, which might be like a parade or an arrest, you know. So it is a different viewpoint on what is important. Other questions? Yeah.
I was curious about time, I guess, in these. I'm assuming there's no steps in archivally preserving the newspapers. Are they made to yellow, or are they going to yellow over time?
For mine? For my work or for
Maybe
these?
for both, yeah.
So, from what I understand in my research for Doug's work, and somebody can tell me I'm wrong, that he has collected this and has saved it purposefully. So I don't really know what that is. These are all scans and digital prints. So these aren't the real papers that we're seeing, and they're inkjet prints. And in his paintings, they are painted reproductions of a section of the paper. He is painting, he makes paintings, and they have an image of the newspaper, and they might be paired with another abstract image. Or he makes paintings, and then there is an inserted image from the newspaper into these, other abstract works. So for him, I'm not exactly sure what his method of archiving is. For me, I am taking as best care as possible of these pieces of the newspaper. So I use archival tissues and boxes and things that that essentially draw out some of the acid from the paper, but over time it will inevitably yellow and crumble, and I accept that. To me, that is actually an important component of the work, that it has a limited lifespan that reflects some of my ideas about how over time, the information itself or the images themselves become more and more abstracted to the point that they may no longer have, permanence or relevance to the culture that is experiencing them at some point in the future.
Yeah, that's awesome that you're thinking about that in your work. That's kind of, this is the distance I've been from.
Right?
Kind of bumps me out. I wish they would get
They were the real ones. I mean, I don't know, Megan, do you know if they're actually silk screens on the papers or? Okay. These are just the digital prints. But yeah, I think.
You said it great in just talking about how time is a means of abstraction.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So it seemed like a very important part to non-archival media.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? No, I'd be happy also just to talk to people individually afterwards. This work is very interesting and moving to me. I think, Doug Ashford is clearly a profoundly intelligent and thoughtful artist and maker, and he's teacher, theoretician, and the ways that he's thinking about power, social dynamics, abstraction as a kind of form of pictorial representation in and of itself are very nuanced. And there's a limited amount that I can actually speak to his work, but I do want to say that I think, kind of broadly, artists all over the country and all over the world are really, as you can see from this exhibition, are really engaging with issues that are of immediate importance to how we think about ourselves as individuals within a kind of larger social and political milieu. And they're responding through a variety of different formats, some that may be more immediately accessible and some that may actually be much more distant. And that method of the form that the work takes, especially if it is more distant, is really calling on the viewer to engage. It accepts also that there will be viewers who don't engage and try to navigate the nuances of the work. I think that that's fine. I think that artists expecting that their audiences are sophisticated enough to be able to kind of navigate through the work. I think that shows their audiences a certain amount of respect. And whether or not one likes it or has an easy way of understanding the work, maybe to some extent, might be beside the point. That, art is a tool for communication, and these artists that are in this show are really communicating in a very high and thoughtful way, I think. So thank you, moCa.